Hello, everyone. Welcome into another episode of Bull Breakdowns here on the Guilty as Charged podcast YouTube channel. My name is Alex, as always, and we're here to talk about some pretty breaking news. I guess it broke when Steven and Tyler were on the pod last night, but Elijah Molden did get a 3-year contract extension worth up to $18.75 million, with $13.5 million guaranteed to prohibit him from hitting free agency and keeping him in LA for years to come. And I think you talk about Molden's season last year and what he was able to do in such short time after being traded here, basically a week and a half before the season started, and how instantly he fit into the defense starting in that Carolina game all throughout the season with clutch interceptions, of course, but just a really good all-around defender. A missed tackle rate of 8.9%. You talk about passer rating thrown against him. Quarterbacks threw 44.8 passer rating when targeting Elijah Molden. So he had an absolute breakout year, crushed it. And ultimately, I think you saw in that Houston playoff game, unfortunately, the absence of Elijah Molden from the injuries and the buildup of injuries that happened in that Patriots game. They missed him, I think, from a communication standpoint in the secondary a lot. He was pretty integral to their defense in that capacity as well. So locking him up for 3 years before he hits free agency is cool. Pretty aggressive move, pretty aggressive contract for Molden too. PFF had projected Molden to get 1 year, $4.5 million in terms of average annual value. His contract clears that by 1.75 million. So, to some extent, I think that is the breakout season he had, as well as the fact that the cap jumped. So, I'm curious to see how a lot of the free agent projections kind of end up living up to what they were predicted to be following the news that the cap could be as high as 281.5 million. We'll get the official number on that soon to see exactly how much money the Chargers, as well as all these other teams, have to spend. But great contract for him. It is pretty similar in structure, actually, to what Trey Pipkins signed in 2023 as kind of a historical comparison between those two contracts. I was just looking at the details this morning. We don't have the full details on Molden's contract, but Trey in 2023, when he was about to hit free agency after his pretty good 2022 season, he ended up getting $15 million guaranteed, $21.75 million total. And then I think his first year cap hit was lower at about $3 or $4 million. Now, we don't know Molden's first year cap hit, but I use that contract kind of as an example to say that first year cap hit for Molden probably will be lower. And then I think you'll see the cap increase in the second year and the third year of that deal. Similar to Pipkins, I do believe that this pretty much is kind of a fully guaranteed 2-year contract for Molden that has the potential to become a 3-year deal. Obviously, should he still be playing well enough, and depending on what the Chargers cap situation is by then, with all the moves they might make over the next 2 years. So ultimately, that's looking too far into the future. But great contract for Molden. He earned it with his play this season. And so what I wanted to do in this video is basically go through kind of what's next for the Chargers in this internal free agency period, and talk about some of the guys that are free agents, some of the guys that could be cut candidates, and sort of what's next following this Elijah Molden extension now that he is locked in for 2025 and the foreseeable future. So what I did was I pulled up the good folks at Over the Cap and their cap calculator. I hope I've made it large enough to the point where you can see it on YouTube. I'm pretty sure you can. And I've gone ahead and I put in the Molden contract. Now, you'll notice the number I put for the Molden contract was a bit about $6 million. Like I just said, I do think the actual evaluation of the Molden contract and that cap hit in the first year is pretty likely to be lower than $6 million. For reference, like I just mentioned, at Pipkins at a pretty similar average annual value, around $7-8 million. He had a $4 million cap hit. And you look at Alohi Gilman's last year which his average annual value was 5.1. His first year cap hit was 3.3, thanks to Joe Ortiz and McGuire for working their cap magic to get that number down a little bit. So in reality, I do think that the cap hit of Molden is probably likely to be somewhere like 4-5 million, maybe 3.5 to 5, somewhere in that range, as opposed to 6. But for simplicity's sake, I have decided to just put it at 6 since we don't know the official details of the contract. So therefore, that's what I've decided to do with one Elijah Molden. So I also have pulled up PFF's free agent rankings. I don't have them displayed on the screen right now, but PFF has a bunch of Chargers players. I think 6. Yeah, I think 6 Chargers players in their top 100 free agents for which they already have contract projections, which Molden jumped by about $1.5 million, $2 million. But still, I think those numbers are at least still decent reference points for what these guys could get in free agency if you're trying to bring them back. I do want to start with cut candidates. And I talked a little bit about this earlier in the week. I have 3 cut candidates, and I think hypothetically you can get to a 4th, which we'll get to in a bit. But I do start by cutting Joey Bosa. I think that you look at how all of this has played out with, Bosa's season last year and over the last number of years, hasn't been able to maintain that level of health, obviously, that you would like to see from him. And he has the biggest cap hit in the league at $36 million. Now, in theory, the cap hit this year is not as big of an issue as it was for the Chargers last year in terms of trying to, balance the sheet, as well as the moves of what they did with Keenan Allen, what they did with Mike Williams in terms of their departures and getting Mack to take a pay cut as well. So the situation technically doesn't require them to adjust Bosa's contract in the same way that they absolutely had to last year. That being said, if you're intent on re-signing Mack, which I do believe they will make an effort to do in this free agency, despite Jeremy Fowler and other reporters saying that his market will be robust, I ultimately do believe Khalil Mack will be back with the Chargers. If you're going to make an effort to do that, and you're probably looking at the PFF projection for Mack right now, he's at $22.5 million per year. He could get more than that in this market. I don't know, from a football perspective, how you run back the Mack Bosa duo and expect different results at this point. Now, we've always talked about Mack and Bosa through the vein of, can they stay healthy, right? And if they do stay healthy, like we saw in the first game last season, Joey Bosa looks spectacular. But unfortunately, you just haven't seen that sustain. And when Bosa came back from the hip injury last year, he did look like a shell of himself, unfortunately, as a pass rusher, numbers dropping across the board. And he had to work himself back from playing 20 snaps to being able to play 50 snaps by the time the playoffs rolled around. I think for me, it's less that there is a financial incentive to cut Joey Bosa more than it is, I just don't know from an edge room, if you're only going to keep 4 or 5 edge players, if Joey Bosa can be one of your top 2. And if you're talking about a renegotiation and taking a pay cut like he did last year, he's still guaranteed that, or not guaranteed, I should say, but if he's on the roster by the time, I think the 3rd day of the league year, he's getting a $12 million bonus for being on the roster. It would be the contract after that you would have to adjust, right? If he were to decide to take a pay cut again, or they asked him to take a pay cut and he wanted to stay around. Does Joey Bosa want to do that again, right? Does Joey Bosa want to take another pay cut, or does he want to say, hey, I'll see what's out there for me in the market? Will the Chargers even ask him to take a pay cut? Do they want him back? Again, these are all things that we don't necessarily know. But to me, you look at the possibilities for the Chargers in this free agency of running it back with Mack, drafting edge players, as well as potentially looking at the market for some, high value edge guys, of which I think there are some pretty good ones in this free agent class as well. I don't think that you can go into 2025 running back a 31-year-old Bosa, or Bosa in his age 31 season, I should say, and a Khalil Mack who will turn 34, I believe tomorrow is his birthday. I just don't know how tenable that is. We did see Max dip in pass rush production last year, although he was still very good. He's a top 15 guy, I would say, at his position. But you're betting on him to stay healthy at 34 years old. You're betting on Bosa to stay healthy at now going on 31. And I just don't know how tenable that is, especially after we just saw, the Eagles dominate the Chiefs from a pass rush standpoint. And we kind of did see the Chargers pass rush, particularly by the end of the year, just not look as good as it did, in that week 1 game that we saw against the Raiders, or some of the standout moments you can pick from this season. But the consistency through the end of the year, to me, was lacking come playoff time. So I've made the decision in my simulation here to cut Joey Bosa. I think there are alternate ways, like I mentioned, for the Chargers to keep him on the roster, whether that's a pay cut situation like last year. But I think if the Chargers are really hell-bent on being a competitive team in 2025, I just don't know how you run this back again with these two guys at their ages, considering their injury history and just considering the probability of them getting hurt in the NFL and the probability of just not being effective, at an older age. So for me, I have made the decision to move on from Joey Bosa. The next cut that I will make is Trey Pipkins. I do think that Trey Pipkins, just for clarification on the Bosa thing, some people have asked me about pre-cut in June 1st versus do you cut him post June 1st and stuff like that. For Bosa, I think because of his restructures and stuff that he's done before, that actually doesn't affect the amount you save, whether it's pre or post June 1st, at least in this over the cap simulation. So nothing really changes, and the Chargers could actually just use the money now instead of waiting till June 1st to be able to use those funds. So people always do that. Oh, you can save more money if you do it post June 1st. But then you can't use the money till then. So I think they're just going to do it now, and they don't actually save more money. Sometimes you can do the post June 1st designation. I think we saw this with Corey Linsley, where they split his contract between they split the dead money on his contract between 2024 and 2025. But very rare situations that we really see that get used, especially not with players who are intent on being, active and testing the market and stuff like that. But yeah, I would also make the decision to cut Trey Pipkins. I think Pipkins, obviously, I think he should get credit for trying to do what he did at guard last year. Look, the coaching staff has said, hey, basically, if you're going to stick around here, we're going to find a use for you, and it's going to be a guard because we're going to draft Joel to play tackle, right? But Trey Pipkins just very naturally is not a guard. And if he's not going to be a starting lineman for you, which I do think they are intent on rebooting this offensive line at potentially right guard, potentially center, do you bring in someone to challenge Zion Johnson, so on and so forth. If you are rebooting the offensive line, I think it's very hard to keep Pipkins on the roster if he's not a starter, because his cap hit, as seen on Over the Cap right here, is about, $9 million or so if you decide to keep him. And that is just too much money for, a swing tackle to make in terms of roster construction. Again, like we said with Bosa, it is not necessarily debilitating to keep Pipkins, but I just don't think there is a fit here anymore. If we had seen better things at guard last year, I think it would be a much different conversation. But considering, I think, the fact the Chargers are very going to be clearly looking for starters this year, I don't see a world in which you can run it back with Trey at his current cap hit. And I do think there's probably some value for him at tackle on the market, just with some tackle needy teams. But because the Chargers have Slater and Alt, there's not really a place for him here, in my opinion. And the last cut I will make, and we'll debate some other ones, is one Gus Edwards. Now, Cutting Gus Edwards does not save the Chargers a lot of money. I guess I should say that on the front end, it's only about $3 million. And hypothetically, the Chargers can keep Gus if they want to, if they believe in his ability to stay healthy as the RB2 to J.K. Dobbins, or maybe an RB3 role, depending on how aggressive they are in the draft at addressing that running back position. But Dobbins statistically had kind of the worst year of his career last year. Obviously he was playing through injuries. He was injured in training camp. He was injured prior to training camp. You're talking about the IR early in the season, as well as getting injured again later in the season. And I think very clearly the ankle injury he suffered didn't quite get right throughout the season. And I think you saw that in his production as well. I just wanted to look up the exact number because I have it off the top of my head, or at least I thought I had it off the top of my head. But Gus Edwards last year, if you look at PFF, was actually the lowest yards after contact per attempt of his career. In 2022 with the Ravens, he had 3.48 yards after contact. In 2023 with the Ravens, it was 2.76 yards after contact per attempt, and last year was 2.66. So Gus's whole thing is that he is supposed to be a tackle-breaking machine. Rutgers legend. I love him. But he's just not that player right now. And we saw this when J.K. Dobbins got hurt last year and had to miss 4 games. The Chargers with Dobbins were a top 15 EPA per play rushing attack in the league. They were 15th from weeks 1 to 12. And when Dobbins got hurt and they had to rely on Gus and Kamani and Haskins and whatever they were throwing out there, they were 30th in EPA per rush in the 4 games that Dobbins did not play. I think a lot of that is offensive line related, of course. And we did see some Gus moments where he looked a little healthy at the end of the season, as far as the Denver game where he breaks off the explosive run. But it's less about the money for me and more about the functionality. And I just think in this Harbaugh-Roman offense, where you are prioritizing having a strong running game, having explosive running backs, I don't know how you can count on Gus again to be the RB2. Now, he doesn't make a ton of money to preclude him from being in like an RB3 type of role, but then does Gus want to do that? I don't know what the answer to that question is, but to me, if you are going to be aggressive at addressing running back at some point in those first 5 rounds, which I think we kind of all expect them to do in the draft, regardless of whether they bring JK back or not, then I just don't see what the utility of Gus is on this roster. If you've kind of settled on Haskins and Vidal and some of the other guys like being your special teams guys anyway. So for me, from a functionality standpoint, I just don't know if bringing back Gus makes sense in that role on the team. So I made 3 cuts. I wanted to mention one more, not necessarily as a cut that I'm going to make in this simulation, but just as something that was actually brought up by the folks at Over the Cap. Alohi Gilman's cap number is $6.75 million, as you can see on the screen right now. The Chargers can technically save $4.5 million by cutting him. This has been brought up by some fans on Twitter and other places. He was actually listed in Over the Cap's top 100 cut candidates in an article they put out earlier this offseason. And, you can see from a cap standpoint why they do. If the Chargers want to free up more money and you can get over $100 million in cap space just with the cuts I've done plus Alohi, sure. I still think they value Alohi on this team. And even though he battled, the hamstring injury last year, plus, not his best season from a coverage standpoint, I do still think they trust him to sort of be in that rotation with him and Derwin and Molden. I think that is part of the allure of bringing Molden back, to be honest, is having all 3 of them and then, kind of a 4th safety spot, whether that's Tony Jefferson or somebody that you get in the draft. and then kind of building out your secondary from there. But I do think that they intend on keeping Alohi Gilman, and I think sort of like we've talked about, they don't, need to open up a bunch of cap space. I think it's just about who is a cut candidate that, may not functionally fit the team as well anymore. So yeah, that's what I've gone ahead and done with those three players. Again, I think Alohi is potentially a debatable one. Another one that people have pointed out is Bud Dupree, who has a $3.6 million cap hit. He's their fourth rotational edge rusher. And I don't know if you want to touch the, Dupree deal and kind of how cheap it is when you don't know exactly where the Bosa and Mack, contracts that you're juggling potentially in this free agency process are going to land. So I think I'm not touching that one for only saving a little less than $3 million by doing it personally. So I decided to make these three cuts. And as you can see, the Chargers have now gone from $70 million in projected cap space to about $99.64 million. And there are other ways that they can bump that number up. They can increase that number by, for example, doing a Rashawn Slater extension. There's a couple other ways to then, save money. Obviously, if you sign some extensions with some of these guys, Rashawn is probably the biggest candidate. Then you can kind of lower that 2025 cap hit. And then some of these free agents that they bring back, while they will cut into that 99 or 100 million number or so, still probably will have lower year one cap hits to the point where if you want to go after big names in free agency, if you want to spend big money in free agency, then they can. So now I want to get into the internal free agent part of this video. Khalil Mack is a free agent. I think there is a way, technically he is on the 2025 cap sheet as far as his dead money from what he renegotiated last year. I'm going to try to add him into this simulation just because I think that in my opinion, I expect Khalil Mack to be back. And as you can see, I've re-signed him to that $22.5 million cap number. I'm not exactly sure what happens to his dead money, because he had about $8 million in dead money or something like that, from the renegotiations they did last year. So I'm not exactly sure what happens to that if the Chargers opt to re-sign him. But PFF's valuation for Khalil Mack was $22.5 million. So I decided to go ahead and bring him back in this simulation. Now, an idea that was posited by Dan Graziano of ESPN, as well as a couple other writers, is Chargers let Joey Bosa and Mack walk and basically completely reset the edge room, go after Josh Sweat in free agency, get guys in the draft. You have Thule, so on and so forth. I just don't think that the Chargers really want to let Mack walk to begin with. I think that they intend on keeping him. And I just think with where this defensive line is, I think if you had that breakout performance from Thule last season, where he really stepped up and became that edge one, edge two, type player as a starter. Not that I would say he plateaued. I do think he continued to get better. But he didn't have that breakout season I think they maybe necessarily expected him to have. And from that standpoint, I do think that kind of contributes to the Mack and Bosa calculus as far as like, which one do you want to keep and how much margin for error do you have? Because I don't think they have a star edge rusher right now where they can go, okay, we let these old guys walk and, sort of pivot to the youth movement. They don't really have the ability to do that right now. And that strategy probably requires you, I think, to then probably use a first round pick on an edge player for sure. I don't know if they're dying to do that, right? And kind of limit their options and hamstring their options in the draft to that degree. Now, if Mack wants to play somewhere else in his last 2 years and he hits free agency, that happens, right? And you can't really do anything about that if Mack is dead set on doing that, for example. But to me, I don't think that the move going into this class should be, hey, we're going to let Mack walk. I just don't see how that benefits them as a contender this year, and you're talking about this next 1 to 2 year window, which could be the last years of Mack's career, I think that you have to do everything around that to get it to work, right? And if he opts to leave in free agency, he opts to leave in free agency. But I don't think the Chargers are at a luxurious enough standpoint, let's call it that, to just kind of go, all right, we've had enough. Like, I don't think that they've developed their edge room, nor have the level of prospect that you need to kind of be comfortable doing that. As much as I do believe in Tuli long term, he's not quite that player yet, I think it's fair to say. So if you look at what we've done with the Mack extension, obviously, kind of like I mentioned with all the other contracts, I think that reality is you probably are going to have a lower year one cap hit than $22 million. But, we've gotten down to $86 million in cap space. I think that new contract might wipe off the dead money that Mack had. At least that's what it looks like on Over the Cap. I'm not exactly sure if that's how it works in real life. Again, not quite that much of a cap guru in the same way that Arjun and Katzen and some of these other people are. So you'll have to bear with me on not knowing the exact science of that, but I hope that's okay. Getting into some of the other free agents that are on PFF's rankings, PFF projects Asante Samuel Jr., who is listed here, to get a 3-year, $43.5 million contract with $26.5 million guaranteed. I don't think that's crazy money for ASJ, as much as it, may seem like that based on obviously him missing the season. That puts him at about, I think, the 17th or 18th highest paid corner. He's still young. I do think a lot of teams will look at it like that. So I actually, as crazy as that number might sound after last year, it's probably not the craziest number if he plays in a different scheme other than this one. But this scheme really relies on its guys to tackle well. And Asante Samuel Jr. at a 22% missed tackle rate in the 4 games that he played this season prior to going on IR with the shoulder stinger injury that he suffered. And Jesse Minter pretty unequivocally, I believe it was after the Pittsburgh game, called out ASJ's tackling as something that he's working on and needs to improve on during the season. I struggle to find the place where you put ASJ in this defense and it works, right? They obviously, landed Cam Hart. They landed Tarheeb. I do think they could have their eyes on the corner market in free agency, as well as I expect them to take a corner in the draft, of course. But if you don't want to ideally play ASJ outside, which is where I think he has to play, you're not putting him in the slot. Because of his size and unfortunately because of the tackling issues. So to me, I think he has to go to another team to be able to get that contract that he's expecting and go forward with it. The shoulder issue is also not nothing, right? I mean, obviously it caused him to miss the last 3 quarters of this season. I don't necessarily blame him for that. He said he's been dealing with it since birth, since he started playing football. And obviously it is a serious condition. If we are to go off of what he said at Baggy Day when the team was eliminated after Houston. But I just think from a scheme standpoint, I just don't know if this Chargers team is intent on bringing ASJ back. And so while he is PFF's number 2 ranked Chargers free agent at number 26 on their overall board, I personally pass on bringing back ASJ. The next one on PFF's big board is J.K. Dobbins, who, as you can see, is a free agent. They have J.K. Dobbins projected at 2 years, $3.5 million per year for $4 million guaranteed and $7 million total. Now, something that I think will bring down J.K.'s market, unfortunately, after the year he had, is, of course, his injury history being extensive with the ACL, knee stuff, Achilles. I think that probably prevents him from getting the kind of DeAndre Swift-like contract that he got in free agency last offseason. So, it probably prevents him, obviously, from being in that Najee Harris territory of what he might be projected to get this offseason. But Honestly, I'm pro bringing Dobbins back, especially if he does come at a number like 1 year, 3.5 million. Even if you put him at 2 years, 10 million or something along those lines, I'm perfectly comfortable with that contract. Obviously, I think there will be some pretty heavy incentive based and stuff like that written into the contract just because of the injury history. But this running game needed Dobbins last year, and when Dobbins was out, it completely sunk into the earth, as we saw in many games last season. So yeah, I'm pretty pro bringing Dobbins back. I'm just going to read PFF section on him. Dobbins' return to form in 2024 was as remarkable an NFL storyline as any across the league, with an avalanche of lower body injuries plaguing him over the last few years. The former Baltimore Raven reunited with offensive coordinator Greg Roman, who assumed the same role in a reunion with his own Jim Harbaugh. Dobbins has always been productive and difficult to bring down when healthy. It's just the staying healthy part that is the real challenge. So I do think that is something that probably will, affect Dobbins' market in terms of the number of teams that are interested in him. I do think this draft class and how many running backs that are in it that can basically play big roles and big snaps this year probably also depreciates what Dobbins could get in free agency. But for the sake of it, I'm just going to go with PFF's projection. I do think Dobbins will beat the $3.5 million number. But let's just, for the sake of it, sign Dobbins to that contract. In a simulation, you can bump him up to 4 million or 5 million. But again, it doesn't necessarily change the direction of what you could be looking for, macro with the cap wise. Like it doesn't change too much. So let's just put him at 3.5 million. And that is another contract that we have signed out of this free agent class and PFF's top list of free agents. Going to the next name, you do have Poona Ford. Poona Ford, who I talked about with Matt Miller last time. He says that the Chargers are intent on re-signing Poona Ford and bringing him back. I do not have any sources on this, but I believe after the season he had, I do believe they are interested in bringing Poona back. And I want him back. He was absolutely tremendous last year. Had one of the most productive years of his career, probably talking about the second or third most productive year of his career, only behind the one big year he had in Seattle. And he stabilizes your defensive line, I think, from really having that nose tackle guy in the middle. So I'm all for bringing Poona Ford back. Should have been a Pro Bowler this year. Absolutely snubbed. And I still fight about that with people, especially when we had Joey Bosa and Bradley Bozeman Pro Bowl nominations. But all that being said, I do think that you bring back Poona Ford. PFF section on him again projects him to get 1 year, $3.5 million. Like the Dobbins contract, could be a little bit higher than that. But Ford had a major bounce back year with the Chargers, as did pretty much every Charger on this list. He was a disruptive force on the interior defensive line and saw a major jump in effectiveness in 2024 compared to 2023. Ford seems to get dinged for his size and lack of draft pedigree, but whenever a team gives him a run, he simply makes plays. His PFF in-season grade last year was 85.3, which was actually fifth amongst all defensive tackles. So I think you do everything you can to bring Poona Ford back to the Chargers. And for the sake of doing this simulation here, I will be bringing him back as well. So that is a 1 year, $3.5 million deal projected by PFF. Again, cap hits, everything else I've said. And I do think that contract could end up being higher than the number PFF has, especially with the salary cap increase. But let's just book that right now and get Poona Ford back in powder blue, which is a big objective for the team this season. Elijah Molden is the next guy on the list, but we know he was already re-signed. So that brings us to Teair Tart, who is PFF's 84th ranked free agent. Tart was obviously signed midseason after, getting bounced around the league for a little bit, obviously after Miami. And Tart was fantastic. Tart was great on film. Whatever you were watching last year, had the one big play in the Houston game that should have arguably been a safety on the Texans. But we're not still, sour grapes about that, are we? I still am a little bit. But all of that being said, you have a guy that is proven as far as like what he can do on the field. One of the better pass rushers on the team, along with Poona Ford in terms of efficiency this year. And so I do think you bring Taylor Tart back. And he's obviously not that expensive to bring back on the open market as well, just because there's not that much pass rush production to speak of. But for me, I think Tart is a guy that I would love to see back along with Poona Ford and whatever other defensive line upgrades they are going to make over the course of the draft, over the course of the rest of the free agency. If they want to be players for a big free agent, like a Milton Williams or somebody like that. I do think Taylor Tart is a guy that you bring back to kind of supplement that. And so for the sake of the simulation, like we've said with all of the other guys, I will also be bringing back Taylor Tart at the number that PFF suggested, which is $2.5 million. So that now brings us to, let's see, on the cap sheet, we have spent roughly $23 million of the money that we saved by cutting guys. So that brings us to $76 million in remaining cap space. Now, you cut out a portion of that, obviously, probably 20 to 25 million roughly in terms of signing all the draft picks, in terms of injuries. So I think this leaves the Chargers probably, if I had to project, roughly around 45, 50 million left in pure spending space. Some of that could be used to, let's say, bring back Taylor Heineke as your backup quarterback. Bring him. He was on, I think, 1.2 million last year. I actually don't totally remember what his contract was, but let's just bring him back. And then you can, argue for any other number of guys. Troy Dye is a big part of their special teams, a big part of what they've done. So I expect him to be back as well. J.K. Scott will be in there. But again, these are all very minimal numbers, I think, as far as, then you have a bunch of IRFA guys like Tucker Fisk, Sibi Fehoko, who's, kind of in that practice squad, end of the roster type tier. Interesting guys from this list that aren't in PFF's top 100 that I do think will be kind of interesting to watch. One is Bradley Bozeman. If you've listened to what Jim Harbaugh said about Bradley Bozeman at a season-ending press conference in terms of the amount of games he was able to play, how stable he was able to be for them during the season, if you believe, take him at his word, then he is a priority to bring back. I don't know how confident I am, as when I interviewed Daniel Popper, I think we were kind of both on the same page that we don't necessarily take any of those comments kind of at face value. I think there's two ways this goes. I think either they sign a premier free agent at center and then, maybe take one in the third round of the draft, or you run it back with Bozeman, hope you can kind of fill something in the draft and maybe bring in some competition. Bradley Bozeman's not going to be particularly expensive to bring back. I think he cost just over $1 million last year, plus incentives and some other stuff, I think. So I think roughly that's not something that, again, alters the Chargers cap calculus as far as they do here. The only thing that could is if they decide to go for a premier free agent in this free agency period. You do have both safeties as free agents. So you see Marcus May over here, as well as Tony Jefferson should be somewhere around here as well. Yep. So both of those guys arguably could kind of be in the conversation to bring them back. Again, don't think they'll be particularly expensive to bring back, so therefore they're not necessarily affecting the cap calculation here too much. We already talked about ASJ. Mustapher is a free agent. Fulton is an interesting name. He is not listed in PFF's top 100 for what it's worth. Hard time calculating exactly what his free agency value is. He got, roughly $3 million last year with the Chargers. I'm curious to see what he gets on the market this year. For all intents and purposes, obviously it didn't end well for Fulton in the Houston game. Dealt with some injuries during the year. But Fulton, to his credit, and I will say this, was a very good tackler. Blew up screens well and had the best tackling season, specifically of his career. Next Gen Stats had him as one of the Chargers with a sub 10% missed tackle rate. And that was one of my big concerns with bringing Fulton into the fold here was how was he going to stand up as a tackler? And relatively speaking, he did pretty well. So I think all things considered, I do think you look at the Fulton stuff, and depending on if the Chargers maybe strike out on a top tier free agent, maybe at corner, if they maybe don't get the guy that they want in the draft, I do think Fulton probably signs well before then. But I think he can be a guy that you bring back if certainly a couple other plans at corner in free agency fall through. And I think for what he was a very serviceable player last year. Obviously, things did not necessarily end well in that playoff game. But I do think he's someone that, that kind of stabilizes your corner group a little bit. You're worried probably about whether Cam Hart can stay healthy. You are, where do you want to play Tarheeb still? If you bring Fulton back, it makes it more likely you can play Tarheeb in the slot as opposed to like having to kind of go back and forth between him outside and slot. So that's one thing, right? That I think is notable as far as the Fulton, free agency, depending on what could happen with that. Denzel Perriman is an interesting name. Obviously, we saw how good the run defense was with him, and it struggled a lot without him too, unfortunately, with his inability to stay healthy during the season as following the Ravens game and then being re-injured in the playoff game. I probably think, considering what they drafted Junior Colson for, as well as the breakout and the emergence of Deion Henley, I think that you probably let Perriman walk. I don't think it's impossible. He could come back too. But I think considering the injuries, considering the age, as well as considering the direction that they really want to move with this linebacker group going forward, I wouldn't be surprised if he was back, but it would kind of have to be at the right number. Morgan Fox, an interesting name to talk about if they need depth in the tackle room, or again, if they want to be aggressive in DT free agency, but they're not necessarily hitting on the right guys or they strike out. I think he's kind of comparatively in that Fulton tier, like I talked about, where they could circle back around to him and see, what he wants to do in free agency. I don't think he's going to be like top priority for them just because I think he is a little bit of a situational pass rusher where you're not necessarily intent on playing him every down due to a little bit of that weakness or, the deficiencies that he has against the run. So I'll be very curious what they do with him as kind of a previous regime product. Obviously very well liked in the locker room, very well liked by the team. I'm just not sure he's back in that capacity next year if they really want to upgrade that interior D-line. Josh Palmer is obviously someone worth talking about. We expect them to be players in the free agent market, whether that is somebody like Advante Adams who gets cut. Are they active on the trade market? But I think Josh Palmer's probably also in that tier of like, hey, if you are not hitting on the guys you want to in this free agency, then he's a fine guy to bring back as like your wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4. And then if your room is something like, okay, we have Ladd, we have, Ladd, maybe like a Keenan Allen, Darius Slayton type player. If you have striked out on some of the bigger names, plus then you have Palmer, QJ Davis, you draft a guy, like that is a scenario that I think might be in play for them, but I do think they will probably aim higher in the free agency wide receiver class. Not many names left to talk about here. I think we've gotten really to the meat and potatoes of it. A lot of the other players are kind of, they could come back, or if the Chargers could let them walk type guys. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I enjoyed making it as far as talking this out and thinking through things as far as a free agency context. So we got the Chargers to roughly 45-50 million to be able to spend in this free agent external market. If you want a Trey Smith, if you want a T. Higgins, assuming he's not franchise tagged, probably will be, or any of the other cut candidates who could get released by the time March rolls around. The Chargers have the resources to do it if they just follow my plan. But again, I'm not the GM, and it would be very bad if I was the GM because all 7 picks would be running backs. So Very good that I am not the GM, but I hope you guys enjoyed this simulation on this episode of Bold Breakdowns. And I'm excited for March, excited to get into all this coverage with Steven and Tyler and all the guys on this channel. I will be on the Locked On Chargers podcast next week, I think on Thursday. We're recording on Wednesday, so stay tuned for that. If you're a fan of that show, I'll be on there. Check out all my work at Boltbeat and stay up to date in free agency on Twitter. And leave us up below. Leave a like, comment, all that. And I will see you beautiful people next time. Bolt up.